As you like it.
Yes. I think I would like to welcome immediately all the speakers. So, Ken Yuda Alexandra, Harry van Bommel here, Mr. Harry van Bommel, and Ken Wapel Tidonla can all come to the stage.
Do you mind where we are? Doesn't
Yes.
matter? I can just like this.
Okay, you can come here.
Yeah.
Of course. Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
I will.
Oh, thank you so much.
Sorry. Okay.
Thank you.
정말로 뜻이들래. A warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us here tonight at this rounded table talk organized by ICT Europe, International Campaign for Tibet. My name is Gunsel Winshen Durje. To shortly introduce myself, I'm a 19-year-old student. I'm Dutch Tibetan, and I currently study public administration at Erasmus University. Not only am I engaged with international affairs, but more specifically, Tibetan activism. So today we're going to discuss whether Tibet is of any importance for the future of Europe and Asia. Tibet, which has been occupied and oppressed by China since 1959. It was often at the heart of human rights violations by the Chinese government. Yet, it doesn't only affect us Tibetans, but its oppression also affects the Uyghur community, the Hong Kongers, and Chinese citizens. It also reaches us here in the Netherlands. And this is exemplified by the two illegal police bureaus, one settled in Amsterdam, in the midst of us, and one settled in Rotterdam. And it shows how our democratic values here in the Netherlands can also be under threat. So, with this growing importance of China in the international discourse, one might start to wonder, where or how can Tibet position itself in this international debate? And what is its relative importance? So these questions we'll examine and we'll talk about with our guest speakers. So thank you for coming here. So let's introduce them. Firstly, I have Ms. Yuda Alexandra. She lives currently in Sikkim, and she represents the people of Kham in the Tibetan parliament in exile. She's serving her fourth term and often works on issues relating to women's rights, human rights, and also representing the youth. She's also the founding director of Empowering the Vision Project, an organization that seeks to empower Tibetan youth. Secondly, we have Mr. Harry van Bommel. He's a known face to us. He's a former member of the Dutch Parliament from 1998 to 2017. His wide political interest, his experience and responsibilities in the Parliament often include human rights, international affairs, and also led to a special interest in Tibet. He's currently the strategic executive advisor of the municipality in Zwolle. And lastly, but not least, Ken Wapel Tidonla. He's the current director of ICT Europe. He looks back on a long career as a Tibet activist. He has also participated during the protest against the Beijing Olympics, and that was the Olympic Games from 2008. He also is experienced in political campaigning and has many interesting stories to tell about his work at, for example, NGOs such as Greenpeace and Swiss Aid. Okay, so thank you for coming here tonight. I'd also like to thank the audience for coming tonight and for Pakhuis and Zwijger for all making this event possible. I'd also like to emphasize that questions from the audience at the end are very much appreciated and also welcomed. So we'll start off with Yuda Alexandra. She has been on a tour, right? You have been on a tour in Europe, and what I'd like to ask you is about your experience in this tour around Europe and whether you felt recognized and also in a sense legitimized if you were as a representative of the Tibetan Parliament. Could you maybe shed light on this?
First of all, I want to actually wish you all on behalf of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, under the coordination of International Campaign for Tibet, Europe, we are three Tibetan parliamentarian delegation on a visit of 4 cities in Europe. We
Countries.
Countries and cities. We actually went to 4 cities, you know. We started with Prague, and then we went to Vilnius, and then Stockholm, and we are here now in Amsterdam. I thought there was a real great reason why this was set up like that. We started with Prague on a great note. It was like a very high-level delegation conference, and Prague being the EU, holding the EU presidency at the moment was very significant for us. And we were in fact, I felt really well supported there. Especially we had this day-long conference on what Czech and the EU can do to stop the crisis in Tibet. And it was actually organized in the Czech Senate and co-hosted by the vice presidents of the Czech Senate. And they were there to give us the welcome address. We had the deputy ministers of the foreign ministry of Czech. We also had speakers from EU MEPs. There were also members speaking from the lower house of the Czech Senate. And they all really were very supportive, and the point that they really drove is that Tibet is an independent country, and they really kind of endorsed that there is cultural genocide in Tibet. Those were some of the things that we also wanted to bring in. And as for me and my colleague spoke on religious freedom inside Tibet, and I spoke on why it is important and it is an interest in EU to support Tibet. So I think we were very well received there, and there was a high level of support. We also met the mayor of Prague. We also met with the speaker and deputy speaker of the lower house. There was also the meeting with this big umbrella organization called Dimas. It's the one that really holds all the major NGOs of Czech Republic together. That was Czech Republic. We also met with the Taiwanese ambassador there. After Prague, we went on to Lithuania, which is also a very interesting country at this point in the history of the world, because they have recently been at loggerheads with China. They have gotten out of the 17+1, which is now 14+1, of the Central European kind of Council, which is working with China on trade and everything. They've come out of that. And after that, they've also established a new Taiwanese representative office there. So they are facing huge embargo and sanctions from China. But they were although they were going through a very intense time, there were security concerns also with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, because they are neighboring Belarus, which is like a proxy Russia, supporter. So they were having a very intense time, yet they kind of hosted us in the CIMAS. We had press conference. We met with the members of parliament, also with the foreign ministries. And even there, we met with the Taiwanese embassy. Then we went on to Sweden. And in Sweden, I felt that compared to Prague and Lithuania, the support was a little bit, it was there, but was much more cautious. They were very cautious, They were like, please don't, the foreign ministry was, don't take our photographs. And you can talk, but please don't put it up anywhere in the social media. And they were like, we support you, but... So we were asking, Sweden was important for us, even for ICT, because Sweden is next in line to take on the EU presidency. So we were hoping something like Prague could also happen in Sweden under their EU presidency. But they were like, not at that same level, but we can think of something. So they were a little kind of cautious, I felt. Although there was that support, there was a great, vibrant Swedish Tibet committee there, which was very helpful. But good thing in Sweden was we also met with other oppressed people. We met with Sami people, we met with the Kurds. There was very good discussion with them. And then here in Holland and in Amsterdam, I feel like our meeting, we had a very good meeting today with the foreign ministry, met with the policy officers working on human rights and multilateral organizations, and also with the officer that works on China. And the meeting was very good. They were both very, I think we had a lot of exchanges between us. But even in Netherlands, I did feel that it was a little bit like Sweden. So there was a much better support and kind of acknowledgement of us as Tibet not being a part of China in Czech Republic, and was there in Lithuania despite their intense condition and situation. But in Sweden and Netherlands, although there was that sympathy, but that legitimizing, kind of encouraging support, I didn't feel as much, to be honest.
So you often emphasize on the presence of a Taiwanese embassy or the significance of Taiwanese representatives. Could you maybe shed light on that and or elaborate on why and how that is significant for you as a Tibetan parliamentarian?
The reason why I said the Taiwanese embassy was that they had no qualms. They were like, yeah, fine. Except for one embassy, which I don't want to mention. All the others were like, yeah, please feel free to talk about our visit, put it on the social media. We are with you. We are the same. We are also against the authoritarian Chinese regime. And we are also saying that we are not a part of China, just like you. Because we have been, for your kind information, I thought I'll share this with you all. We have this, throughout our journey, throughout our visit, what we have been doing is to the foreign ministries, to the Senate, to the parliamentarians, we've been giving a gift. We brought this gift with us. This is a gift, actually, which proves, it's an evidence of Tibet being an independent country prior to Chinese occupation in 1950, Chinese occupied Tibet. And this is actually Shagapa, who was the former finance minister of Tibet in independent Tibet. And he visited many countries, between 1947 and 1949. And this is a proof of that. There are all these visas from different countries, from USA, from UK, from Italy, India, Iraq, Switzerland, and many other countries, India, of course. And we are giving this as a gift. Some of them, we have framed them. Some we are giving like brochures. So what we were actually trying to tell them was that please reject the Chinese narrative that Tibet is a part of China, because Tibet was never a part of China, is not a part of China. Tibet is illegally occupied by China. And we need your validation also, because when we are negotiating with China, if you buy into that Chinese narrative that Tibet is a part of China, then for them there is no incentive to kind of negotiate with us. Because then they'll say, this is our domestic affair, you are interfering, and you are actually hampering the territorial integrity of China and stuff like that. So this was one thing that we were drilling. And Taiwan had the same message. They were like, Taiwan is not a part of China, was not a part of China, is not part of China. And we are also democratic. Just like you, we also believe in democratic values, and our goals and ideals are similar.
Okay. So, Mr. Haifongbol, right? So, as a former member of parliament, you could have been one of those who received this gift. How would you kind of react, or how would you feel about receiving such a gift? Would you feel, oh, okay, this is actually really interesting, or would you kind of shove it away? So what would your reaction be, and do you believe it has significance?
Well, first of all, I would have welcomed Yuden as a visitor to Parliament. Unfortunately, Yuden has not been able to talk to any group in Parliament with this visit. And that is unfortunate, because yes, the ministry is an important player, but Parliament quite often is able to demand questions from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to bring certain human rights violations to the political level, to the ministerial level, to the European level. The Netherlands, the official position of the Dutch government is the one China policy, meaning that Tibet is a part of China, that Taiwan is a part of China, and that any human rights issue should be addressed through the human rights dialogue between the EU and China. So Brussels is the central player when it comes to talking about human rights violations in China. So obviously a visit of a parliamentarian from the Tibetans to the Dutch parliament would have been of great value. It would have shown that the Dutch parliament takes the parliament of Yudin seriously, that we see the Parliament of the Tibetans as a serious partner to discuss issues related to the status of Tibet, related to human rights violations, but also related to the position of China in the world. Because today, everybody looks at Russia and Ukraine. But if you look at the broader question that is at stake, then we're talking about world powers.
Yeah.
And there are only three world powers: Russia, the United States, and Europe. And China is, of course, trying to become a global player to the extent of the EU and the United States. China has defined a policy to become the world's leading, the world leader economically, but also militarily in 2050, so in 30 years. Today, the European Union is the most important economic player worldwide. The power of the United States is fading away. So China is an important player, and since Russia is not so important anymore and losing power also over the Ukraine war, we see world leaders. The first G7 leader to go to China was the German Chancellor early this month. So what we see is that the focus is changing, is moving to China. And when we look at human rights violations, everybody knows what's going on with the Uyghurs. Worldwide, it is being condemned. The United States openly speaks of genocide on the Uyghurs. The United States also addresses the Tibetan issue. The EU does not do that. The EU is afraid of addressing the human rights violations related to Tibet. So my question to you would be, have you been able to talk to the Dutch human rights ambassador? When I was in Parliament, we tried to get the human rights ambassador, Dutch human rights ambassador, to visit Tibet, which is impossible. But only knocking at the door of the Chinese government is a statement. Now, is the Dutch government, and I know that the former Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands Parliament was more active on Tibet. We see that when there's a human rights debate. We see that when the budget debate is there. We see it in the general interest in China, in EU-China politics as well. So I think we should talk more about how can we get the Tibetans knock at the Dutch Parliament and at other European, meaning member state parliaments, such as Germany, which is an important player and which is shifting its focus to China.
So, Mr. Wangpo, how do you feel about this shift? Do you, as a director of ICT, you are often in charge of the political agenda as well. Like, how do you, once you approach the parliament members, do you agree with, or do you share the same views as Mr. Harry van Bommel?
Yes, I think, yes, of course, I share these concerns, and also there's a wish on our side to have a better relationship with parliamentarians, with government agencies, and also with the civil society. Now, what we see, we are having this discussion in the moment of the European world history when things are changing dramatically. And I think, or what I experienced is there is a lot of confusion also on the side of the policymaker, because it's not really clear in which direction many of these developments are going. It's also not clear how they should look at the issues, also to re-evaluate and reassess the Tibetan situation or the Tibetan question. And the reason for doing this tour, and also Yudla showed this piece of document, was sort of have a fresh look on the Tibetan issue. In the past, we had a debate about, or the Tibetan issue was sort of presented in a conceptual framework of human rights. And the reason why it was so, and why it was not discussed in a more political manner or in geopolitics, was there was not real interest to challenge China on the issue of Tibet and on the geopolitical front. But this has changed in the last 12 months, and you are completely right. It has to do with China's ambition, to become the superpower, but it has also to do with the awakening which happened here in Europe. Because people, after this long time of COVID, after this economic sort of erratic behavior by China, and also after seeing how close China was acting together with the Russians, have completely changed their view on China. I was just recently in the parliament at the hearing of on China, and there were 6 experts speaking on China, and there was not one person who sort of presented some chance for the Netherlands or some future bright prospect. Everyone was talking about fear and suspicion and danger and so on. So we are in a situation where we need more thinking about the issue of Tibet, also how the Europeans sort of should see the issue. And from our side, from ICT side, we would like to suggest to look at Tibet not only under the sort of, to see it as a human rights issue, but really understand that Tibet is connected with security, European security, with the European interests for having democratic societies prospering around the world.
Yeah, I just thought I'd add to that what Wangpula was saying. No, my feeling from my experience in this visit to the 4 countries, I felt that in Czech Republic and Lithuania, there was this very strong connect with us because they have experienced communist regime. They have experienced Russian aggression. So with the Ukraine war also, I think they felt even closer, I feel like that connection was very strong. And for us also, when we go out to speak with all the countries, what we were saying was that European Union is actually a community of values, right? And that value that you kind of really cherish, the value of human rights, freedom, democracy, multilateralism, is directly being challenged by China, and in this case, even Russia, because when Russia's aggression in Ukraine and China's aggression on Tibet, they both have the same worldview, right? The ideology is the same. They are really strong allies, and the Marxist-Leninist kind of policies that they work with is really, that's what they want now. They want the world order that is kind of based on liberal values to be shifted from liberal values to a more kind of their worldview. So I think Europe, like Wangpula was saying, has really a stake in trying to kind of counter that, And we Tibetans, that's what we are doing. We are fighting for those values for human rights, for democracy, and against the Chinese occupation. So we have really much at stake, and our interests, I think, really intersect. So that's what I wanted to add to what Wangpula was saying. Yeah.
Yes, because although Tibetans in India currently have a government in exile, are kind of one of the frontrunners of democracy, they are a democracy in exile. So I wonder, do these governments truly view you as a legitimate representative of the Tibetan people, since you are a government in exile and you're not the government of Tibet in itself? So how do you experience that?
Since the Chinese occupation, okay, when the Chinese troops first landed in Tibet, 1949-50, many Tibetans had to escape, right? You know the story, in 1959. We did tolerate them for some time. We thought that there was going to be a way that we can work together. There was this agreement that was forced on us in 1951 that for the first time, somehow China had something in paper that to show that they are the legitimate owner, but they were not. It was enforced on us under duress. So when we came into exile, His Holiness, who is a leader that is totally supported by Tibetans inside and outside Tibet, right? We was in exile in India, so we set up a government in exile. And we are the voice for them. And they know that. we can make out when they demonstrate, when they protest, when they self-immolate. It's very clear. They're talking about restoration of freedom, the return of the Dalai Lama to Tibet. So it's very clear that we are the voice of the voiceless, and we have a system here. His Holiness could have easily went on to become the leader and enjoyed how Xi Jinping is enjoying, like extension of term and consolidation of more and more powers, but he felt the need to democratize. So he voluntarily transferred all his powers to elected leaders, and we have elected leadership today. And in that, I also want to say that we don't have one leader, although we have a Sikyong, but we have many NGOs. We could also do with, we are in exile, we don't need so many NGOs. But we have many leaders, and we have accountable, transparent institution, rule of law, everything is there. Because we do feel that despite challenges, democracy is the way to go. So
Yeah.
did I answer your question? Or?
Yes. I would ask Mr. Howie van Bommel, do you believe that Tibetan democracy could be one of the reasons why the Netherlands should care about Tibet?
Obviously, because in the region, a democracy as organized by the Tibetans is rare. So only for that reason alone, it should be taken not for granted. It should be valued for what it is. And also, that's why I would have found it very important if you would have been able to talk to Dutch parliamentarians. Next time parliamentarians from the Tibetans come to the Netherlands, I think we should make it a shared effort to make sure that this happens. Because I do realize and remember when His Holiness came to the Netherlands that the Dutch government was not willing to receive His Holiness at the highest level. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time was only willing to receive the Dalai Lama as a religious leader, not as a political leader, and to make sure that there wouldn't be any trouble with China, he turned this into a religious meeting with other religious leaders in The Hague, so as not to have His Holiness in the same position that he was in the United States of America or in France or in many other countries. So I see a policy in the Netherlands that is that when it comes to human rights violations, we dare to speak out, politicians dare to speak out, but when it comes to China, the huge China and the importance of the trade relation with China, then we fall back upon the European position, saying that, it's a one China policy, and the Tibetans, the human rights violations, we leave that to the human rights ambassador or to Parliament, but the Dutch government is very reluctant to be outspoken on this issue, and there's a lot of terrain to be gained there. So if I can be of any assistance in that respect, count on me.
Would you like to respond?
No, there's nothing to disagree, and I would be glad to also seek your advice on this matter. I just wanted to remind you that we are having this discussion in a moment when in China people are protesting. And it's for the first time since 30 years that people go on the streets, do protests, and it's not only about their personal situation or their economic livelihood or whatever, but they really call in many cities of China the downfall of the Communist Party. They scream down with Xi Jinping and so on. It's unseen, you see. And the reason why it is, there are many sort of speculations. I think it has to do with COVID, but it also has to do with this super rigid approach that Xi Jinping sort of is applying on the Chinese people since many years. And we see that there is no real future for such a authoritarian regime. On the other hand, the question is now, if we just also speculate a little bit, and I think the governments in the Western countries have the obligation and also the responsibility to think about this Chinese situation in the future, and who knows what happens, you see, how this region, you see, sort of develops. It's not really said that this Communist Party will remain there forever. And if I look at the situation now, I am inclined to say some big changes are, you see, lying ahead of us. But then if something like this happens, when we Tibetan look at this situation, we are not completely happy, you see, because it really means also a lot of disturbances on Tibetan plateau. We are also a bit afraid, you see, about the craziness that maybe sort of come so from China all over in the neighborhood and so on. But on the other hand, we Tibetans, I think, also have a solution. And we presented, His Holiness the Dalai Lama presented a plan many years ago, which was called the 5-point peace plan and the zone of peace. And it was an idea, a vision for the heart of Asia, which would have been or could be a benefit for the whole region. And if I look at the region now, if we talk about security, about democracy, about civil societies, freedom, and so forth and so on, there are not many societies who have such a strong commitment on these values. And the Tibetan have at least a vision, maybe not the best plan at the moment, but at least a commitment to move in this direction. And I think this is something very valuable. And Europeans should see this also as a thing which protects their interests in the region and maybe also their sort of value systems. Yeah.
Can I just add to what, Herrick was kind of mentioning about welcoming His Holiness as a religious leader. So that got me thinking, and I was like, one of the points that we have been really kind of raising with all the people that we were meeting in this tour was also denouncing China's attempt at interfering in the reincarnation of the Tibetan Lamas, particularly His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and actually endorsing that His Holiness has the exclusive right to determine who the next incarnation would be. That is something I think even Holland, the Netherlands, who is endorsing His Holiness as the religious leader of Tibet, must be strongly condemning. There must be a strong condemnation of that, I think. And also I feel that what Wangpola just said, I think we are in a very, very interesting time because the consolidation of absolute power by Xi Jinping and the draconian policies that he has unleashed, particularly in the last couple of years with zero COVID policy, we can see that there are conditions being created in China for change. I feel that. I don't know if all of you feel that. There seems to be things that are changing, and maybe we might have a new kind of, I don't know, not a full-fledged democracy, of course, but I think there are already these simmerings of people really longing for freedom, democracy, down with Xi Jinping. We are seeing all those, right? People are frustrated with being locked down, but they are also very frustrated with this government. So it started with, of course, in East Turkestan with the Uyghurs, with the fire there, went on to Shanghai, to Beijing, and many cities of China, right? Even in Tibet. We've had Tibetans and more than Tibetans, the Chinese migrants who were protesting, But many of them now in Shanghai and Beijing, it's not just about COVID, not just about the lockdown. They are sick and tired of, Xi's kind of draconian policies. I think there are those, I think there are already seeds of, hopes for us, because every crisis, like we see, there is always some opportunity and some silver lining, So I see a hope that we are I believe they are creating conditions for change in China. So I see that, And also, one more. I think you mentioned that we should be meeting with the parliamentarians. We tried, and ICT tried also, but we were not able to. Somehow, I don't know what happened. We were not able to meet with the Dutch parliamentarians here. Yeah.
Okay. If I could react on the optimism I hear from both speakers for change in China. I do hope you're right, and I see a new situation in China, and I see the seeds that you just mentioned, the seeds for change in China. However, if we look at the facts on the ground and the reality, China is a huge country, and the government of China has so many tools to oppress the people.
That's true.
In many ways. the oppression in China is stronger than in Iran. But there's another difference between the two, and that's not just the oppression. That is also the solidarity that is shown in the world. We had demonstrations in the Netherlands for freedom in Iran. We did not have them for the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or Hong Kong. Unfortunately, when we look at the sanctions against Iran are numerous. The sanctions against China are only very few. Even today, I had a look at the EU sanctions map. Google that word, EU sanctions map. Then you get the map of the EU where all the sanctions are listed. And then you see that China only has one form of sanctions, that's against arms trade. There's no arms trade from the EU countries to China. But other than that, there's a couple of sanctions that are related to individuals who are part of the government and that can be held responsible for what happened in 1989, Tiananmen Square. That is what the sanctions are still based on. The US sanctions go further. The United States has sanctions from 2020. They were renewed, related to Hong Kong, to Tibet, to I think even Taiwan was mentioned. So the United States has a stronger China policy when it comes to human rights violations. So there's still a lot to be done. And the people in Iran who are on the streets, and more than 15,000 people have been taken into arrest, and many people will not return to their homes in Iran. Still people go to the streets. So when it comes to a revolutionary mood, I see the signs are there in Iran. I don't see them yet in China. Unfortunately, maybe this will change, and the people in Iran know that the rest of the world is watching, and unfortunately, it is not the same in China. Unfortunately, and it has to do with the grip that the Chinese government has when it no journalist can enter into Tibet.
Would you like to respond?
Yes. On the other hand, I would say the Iranians are also not a threat for Europe. They are, of course, for the region with their plans for this nuclear bomb and so on, yes, but they are not conceived as a systemic rival. And this has changed in Europe. I think there is a clear language now. And if I have to compare, let's say 10 years ago or 20 years ago and now, I think I see for the first time for Tibetans, but also for Uyghur people, for other people in from the territory of the present China, a chance, you see, not only to have a human rights sort of dialogue or issue, but people who want to listen and say, okay, you are maybe also of interest for our own security interests, yeah, and that's very valuable. This has changed. There's a real paradigm shift in this debate going on. Of course, it's right in the beginning, and we have to have much better concepts, better frameworks to explain also to our friends is how we see sort of the mutual interests for each other. I was recently in Brussels at the meeting, and then there was the question, what can the EU do for you, sort of. And I said, please don't ask this question anymore. It's not something that you do for us in future. If you cooperate with us, think that you are doing something for yourself, for your own security interests and your long-term interests. And I think this thinking is new, but it's sort of linked to the realities that we are living in at the moment. Yeah.
I just wanted to add.
Yes, of course.
To what Wangpola is saying. I think I also, when I met with the people in the foreign ministry, I told them as well that the Netherlands was one of the first countries to recognize PRC in 1950. They were second only to UK. You know, they recognized People's Republic of China in 1950, but they had to wait for diplomatic mission because in the UN, Taiwan was there till 1971. So in 1971, they were again, I guess, one of the first countries to set up the mission there. So this year, you're celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations with China, right? So I think there, precisely because you're saying all that, there is a need for Netherlands to understand that trading with China, ultimately, who is benefiting? I think there needs to be an assessment of that, because I think Netherlands is one of the biggest trading partners, right? Second biggest, if I'm not mistaken, outside of EU. Is that right? Because that's what I read. So it's one of the Netherlands' biggest trading partner is China, isn't it?
Same as for Germany.
Yeah.
Germany. So yeah. So I think the time has come to really review that. Whether by depending, that's what China wants you to become, totally dependent on them for raw materials, for technology, for trade, everything, right? So why don't you, I mean, this is what our supporters, we are all supporters here, right? Why don't we lobby on that, they kind of come up with good reasons why the Netherlands should diversify. Many countries are doing now. US is doing. India, of course, Taiwan is doing, right? So many other countries. I think there is a need to look elsewhere than to kind of bank all your kind of trade and everything with China that's so opaque, no accountability, there is no rule of law. Ultimately, who is gaining from this? I think there's need to be a review of that, I feel.
Okay, thank you. So to quickly contextualize the talk about the protests in China, to give a bit of insight, currently there are mass protests happening in China. They call it the blank paper. You hold a white sheet of paper, a blank paper like this. They hold it on up and they make pictures of it, and it's happening in China right now. Also for the Uyghurs, and the white paper kind of symbolizes all the things that they want to say, but they cannot. And it started as a reaction, as a response to the zero COVID policy of China, yet has now become a symbol for also all the human rights violations. Just to give a bit of context. So now, Mr. Halil van Bommel mentioned Iran and how it kind of was able to ally and was able to gain the international response that they wanted to. And Iran wasn't the only country which had gained sympathy of the world. It was Ukraine as well. And therefore, I would like to ask Mr. Halil van Bommel, do you believe that there are any takeaways for the Tibetan movement looking at how Ukrainians have reacted to Russia's invasions? Do you believe we as the Tibetan movement can learn from this?
Absolutely. If we look at the media success that Ukraine, that especially the Ukrainian president, has reached in getting the Ukrainian story, the Ukrainian narrative out in the world, I mean that is amazing, and it's going to be textbook material for politicians in the coming decades. If the Tibetans were only able to have 10% of the success of the Ukrainian president, then Tibet would be on the front page every second day. Unfortunately, that is not the case today. So I think it would be worth the while to study how this was done in publicity, but also in practical politics. How was the Ukrainian president able to literally get the support of the big countries, big alliances like NATO? Of course, there is one particular difference, and that is that Ukraine is in between NATO and Russia. And if you look closely at the dispute, at the conflict, it is more a conflict between Russia and NATO, or Russia and the Western world, than it is between Ukraine and Russia. So, but still, there are lessons to be learned, and publicity and political discourse are two of the more important aspects that that, for instance, the parliamentarians in exile can learn from, and they can take that message to their fellow parliamentarians.
Yeah.
That's why I insist on you talking to Dutch and German, for that matter, and other European parliamentarians in Brussels, but especially in the member states, because they have a direct influence on their political leaders. And yes, there's a lot to be learned. I don't expect it will ever be the same. I mean, the United States is not going to send billions of arms to Tibetan troops or anything like that. That's not going to happen. But in a historical sense and in the practical sense, the difference are, of course, more numerous than the comparisons. So, but yes, there are lessons to be learned, and I'm sure that the Tibetans are looking at the Ukrainian issue with great interest, and to see how this conflict evolves, and especially how they have gained the solidarity of the entire world. It's an important lesson to be learned there.
Yeah. Do you have any concrete lessons which you think you'll implement as a Spanish parliamentarian to kind of translate it to international support for the Tibetan cause?
Yeah, I think there are many lessons to learn from Ukraine. I think their unity, resilience, I think that's very inspiring, you know, how they fighting together despite, you know, so many. Nobody predicted that the war will prolong, you know, it'll go on like this.
Then do you believe that there's a lack there of unity then in the Tibetan community? If you emphasize
I
that?
wouldn't say so, but we have not reached that stage where we are fighting a war. Also, I wanted to say here that Tibetans, as of now, Tibetans have no plans to have a war with China. So that situation is again different. With Ukraine, when Russia invaded their territories, they fought. They also fought with the full confidence that NATO, army will support them, right? Tibetans, we have, as you know, we have within us, we are quite diverse in views. Some people are, many, of course, deep within, we all want independence, but with His Holiness's vision, we have moved to a middle way approach. And we have actually bought into this whole path of nonviolence, and working through dialogue with China, which is also a democratic way of doing things. We also want China to learn from us, and that we have to resolve conflict through dialogue, resolve issues, unresolved issues with dialogue. So we are on that path. I don't know if that changes in future, but as of now, this is our path, and I don't imagine us taking arms against China and fighting, like the war that you have in Ukraine. And I don't even, like you said, we are in no illusion that America is going to fight with us or the NATO army will come, because there are, other dimensions to it, other layers to it. But in Taiwan, it's possible. In Taiwan, it is possible that America might take arms if China decides to have a war in Taiwan, decides because they really want Taiwan with them, and in that kind of ambition, they might try to invade Taiwan, which I also see that in the near future, I don't see it as a possibility, but everybody is concerned about that. People in Taiwan are concerned, and we don't know with authoritarian regimes what they might do, right? In that case, then there might be a war, and US, because of their agreement that they will come in support, may have to get into that war, and if they're fighting China, that's our opponent as well, that might happen.
So, for Genwampula, I believe that ICT Europe also maintains this stance on nonviolence. If so, do you believe that furthers our movement, or does it maybe even constrain our movement if you look at Ukraine?
You see, International Campaign for Tibet is a supporter group, and it's not up to us to define the Tibetan positions. There are people like Yudla who are members of the Tibetan Parliament, and they are the policymakers. So it's not up to us. But what we do is we observe the situation, and we try to sort of share our learned lessons, or lessons learned with her and her colleagues and so on. And what we see now in this context of Ukraine is definitely sort of the ability of Zelensky to say, no, I don't just escape from this country. I stand and take up the fight. Yeah, I think this was obviously a very strong trigger for everything that followed afterwards. Yeah, this is lessons learned. Then I also think there was a sort of we Tibetans, and not only we Tibetans, we were conditioned for a long time to see ourselves as victims. Yeah. Of Chinese occupation, of Chinese this and that. And I'm happy that now, for example, larger NGOs like Amnesty and others, they don't use this word, you human rights victims. They talk about human rights defenders who sort of get in trouble. I think that's the better terminology. But in Tibetan mind, there was this, I think, there was a tendency, you see, to see oneself as victims, basically. But then with this Ukraine issue, I think people started to have a dialogue and debate on this, yeah. And especially also the Yugo situation, we were following the events there very closely and also try to analyze what does it mean for us. And what is clear for me, at least, is we shouldn't sort of go into a competition to the bottom and say we are even more sort of victimized by Chinese. But because there are other strengths that we can offer, we have some vision, as I explained earlier. We are successfully withstanding this huge pressure now for more than 70 years and are quite okay still, yeah. We have a democratic system, even the Dalai Lama system, you see, people think this of a sort of a religious thing, which is basically okay, yeah, but it's not only, you see, it's a way of handling our political system. And if I compare the Communist Party with the Dalai Lama system, I would say our system is more adaptable to the future. In the 200 years, you see, we were able, you see, from change from one system to the other, and now the Dalai Lama system works actually quite well with the democratic system, yeah. And so we are more capable, I think, you see, to adapt to the new realities. So there are many strengths and lessons that we also could share with our neighboring communities, yeah.
Yeah.
To kind of turn back the conversation to Russia's invasion in Ukraine, for Mr. Hallie van Bommel, to what extent do you think that Russia's invasion in Ukraine has affected Dutch policy towards Russia? And if there is a change in foreign policy in relation to Russia, do you believe that also affects our China policy as well?
First of all, let me remind the words of our Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said that we were in this war as well. But we chose the side of Ukraine. We are sending arms to Ukraine, more than 130 million. At the time I was in Parliament, I know that there was a shortage of basically everything for the Dutch army, but now we're sending 130 million of arms worth to Ukraine, which is incredible in the Dutch political history. So yes, we are involved in this war, and the Dutch government has supported all the sanctions against Russia, and also the international position that Russia should retreat from the occupied territories, which, when it comes to Crimea, will not happen, I think. So the relation between Europe and Russia and the Netherlands and Russia will remain heavily under pressure for the coming years, I'm quite sure. And that will also have an effect on the relation between the EU and the Netherlands with China. Because however China is not aiding the Russians, it is more or less on the same position as the Russian when it comes to geopolitical issues. Still, again, referring to the sanctions that are taken against China, the Netherlands, and the EU, and we see it in the German position, are not willing to distance themselves from China.
Yeah.
So as a result of worsening relations with Russia, the EU, and we see in the German example, the EU might strengthen the relations with China, meaning turning a blind eye to human rights violations, legitimate issues such as the Tibetan and the Hong Kong and the Taiwan case in the future. So things going sour with Russia might mean that we will be soft on China, which I detest completely, but that might be the outcome of this process.
Would any of you like to react, respond? No specific?
Yes, just as an information, Charles Michel is traveling on December 1st to China.
And who's Michelle? Sorry, maybe to...
EU Council.
EU Council.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's clarify.
President.
President, sorry, yeah. And the International Campaign for Tibet was invited also to give him a briefing about the situation. And there were also other groups such as Human Rights Watch and some other groups, yeah. And I think this never happened before, yeah. This is also sort of a signal, you see, that the EU sort of tries to understand. I agree totally, you see. We are not there where we want to be, and we lack many sort of steps in between. But there's a growing awareness that we need to address this China issue in a much more fundamental way, better understand what the future options are, also understand what the regional options are there, and so on. And as I said, I feel much more confident today as compared to 10 years ago. Finally, there's a little bit of movement. Finally, there's a sort of also a energy for a new debate, discourse, on these issues. Yeah, and this was not the case. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
true.
I just feel that I do not understand why EU would strengthen its relationship with China faced with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, because the two countries are very, very similar. In fact, one even more rigid than the other, right? Both of them are authoritarian, both of them are with the same ideology, and they had, just before the Russians actually attacked Ukraine, they had some pact together, China and Ukraine. They met just before the Olympics also, where they talked about, and China said, don't do the war. They already had all that was worked out. And when we were going to different countries, we also met with many researchers who were saying that China was really spinning the same Russian narrative on Ukraine. So I don't understand why EU would still make a stronger relationship with China faced with
For
Russian
economic
aggression.
reasons. For economic
reasons, yes.
Only for
but,
economic reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're faced with all this kind of transnational aggression. You've also read what she was also mentioning, the Safeguard Defenders report on all these overseas secret police operations, So there are security concerns, there are technological concerns, So faced with all that, there needs to be really a review of and EU, when we met with some of like you said, that we should meet with parliamentarians, we try our best. We try to meet with as many parliamentarians as we can. Sometimes we manage to meet more, and sometimes we manage to meet less, and sometimes we manage to meet no one. But we also have this World Parliamentary Convention on Tibet, and we have had 8 of them. The last one was in Washington, D.C., where we brought parliamentarians, particularly to have a conference on Tibet. And there we actually talked about not just this particular point where I said to kind of counter the Chinese narrative on Tibet's status and treat Tibet as an occupied nation, but also when it comes to EU, there's also a need for EU to consider, just like the US, a special coordinator for Tibet, which EU has never considered for reasons, I'm sure good reasons, but we would like to push for that. And if not on Tibet, at least on China, because you are facing so many issues with China, you know, when it comes to human rights. So for human rights defenders, for Tibetans, it's not only Tibetans inside Tibet are victims of Chinese oppression, are suffering under Chinese oppressive regime, but even outside in the diaspora, not just Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers,
absolutely.
Chinese
Yeah.
dissidents,
Yeah.
our space is shrinking because Chinese have all these, what do you call it, so-called secret police to monitor and to kind of, even they have extradition treaties with many countries in Europe, right? Where under the garb of, you know, whatever, that fraud and all that, which they might make up some stories, they could extradite dissidents and pro-democracy
it has happened.
activists also.
Yeah.
So I think EU needs to be much more vigilant, and there must be counterintelligence on to monitor what China's doing. And China really is taking full advantage. I think they are exploiting the democratic spaces that we have, you know. So there we need to be really careful. I think it's very, very important that you know, because China does want to have a different worldview that is totally in contradiction of what EU stands for. I think those are very important. The values are really important. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think to tackle the last topic of today, as Ginyuda Akhuzanala said and mentioned, that security could also, for example, be one of the many subtopics we can tackle or we can suggest to talk about when engaging with the Dutch Parliament. And Kim Wangbala, as the director of ICT Europe, you have the task to manage so many different subtopics of Tibet. You have climate change, you have privacy, security, you have religious freedom, reciprocity. So where do your political priorities lie when engaging with the Tibetan government? What would be kind of your first topic, second topic? How would you, on which topics would you emphasize?
Now, at the moment, definitely there's this issue of the police station and transnational repression, and I think this is something that we will also, in cooperation with the Tibet Support Group Netherlands, whose representative is here with us, Rosemarine, yeah, we will have a demonstration on the Darmplatz and on 10th December, and I think what we ask for from the Dutch government, and we sent an open letter to Mark Rutte, ask him to receive a group of people who are affected by this transnational repression. And we are doing, we came up with this demand because, yes, we have to report these calls that are coming from the police station, this sort of uninvited people showing up in the neighborhood of Tibetans who live there. Uyghur people are especially targeted by this police station. But on the other hand, what we also need is visibility, you see, for those who are affected. And the Dutch government should come and stand with the people in the public and say, what you are sort of undergoing at the moment is not acceptable to us. And it's not, I think what we need is not only some political moves, but also visibility by the Dutch government. And that's something that we ask at the moment for. There are other issues which are sort of similar nature, yeah, where we would sort of address these issues in, let's say, in Germany or Italy or elsewhere in other countries. But now at the moment, I think this is a very, very important issue. Then this morning, when we went to the Dutch Foreign Ministry, my last remark to the ministry was, you should see what the Tibetans are trying in this region, in Asia. There's Central Asia and there's Inner Asia. We are in Asia. What we are trying there is important. It's important because it's the complete sort of antithesis to what the Chinese are doing, yeah. And even if there's not much hope for us, you see, you should keep this chip in the game, you see. It's in your own interest, you see, yeah, for the European interest, you see. Even if you do it for yourself, you see, think about this, yeah. I think what we need is the short-term sort of actions by the government, but also sort of a long-term vision on this whole issue here.
So being a young person myself, I'm 19 years old, I'm a student, and one of the biggest topics which engages us is climate change. So I kind of miss that here when, when I talk about these interests. Do you have any reasons why you don't mention climate change, or do you believe, we should use it when talking or engaging with the Dutch government?
Actually, this because we had only very limited interaction here, but with all our interactions in Czech Republic, in Lithuania, in Sweden, we did mention, because climate environment is of a huge concern for us. You know, Tibet being the roof of the world, the water tower of Asia. We also call it the third pole, North Pole, South Pole, third pole, right? And it's really the source of many, many, many rivers in Asia. So what's happening inside Tibet, what we were actually saying was, one of the point was that there needs to be a scientific study of how the Tibet's environmental degradation is affecting global climate change. Because scientists have been saying that whatever's happening at the roof of the world has definitely impact on the climate change and global warming. But we need proper study of that. So we have put that as one of our key points as well. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. But can I add something else?
Of course.
But it may not be a part of the climate change thing.
No.
Is it okay? Because I feel to the Dutch government, I'm not saying that you are representative of Dutch government, but we are here in Holland and I'm with Dutch people. If the Dutch government is not able to speak out and say that Tibet is not a part of China, at least maybe it should not then be so vocal about Tibet being a part of China. They could at least avoid not being too vocal about it. If you cannot say that Tibet is not part of China. And the other thing is the use of language, I feel, is so important, right? So when it comes to Tibetans, China actually thinks or treats us as a minority. But we are not a minority, we are a people. And as Tibetans, as a people, Tibetan people have right to self-determination. I don't know if if the Dutch government can say that Tibetan people, and not like how the Chinese call us ethnic minority, because minorities have no right to self-determination. They are part of the country, right? But we are a people with our own language, our own culture, our own identity. We are a civilization, we are a nation, we are occupied. So even if you can't acknowledge that, but at least maybe there's no need to pronounce that Tibet is a part of China. Maybe that can happen.
Could you maybe give an example of how it is so vocal? Is it through policy or through discussions? How does the Dutch government apparently vocalizes its?
I'm not saying that the Dutch government is vocalizing, but China wants that, and many countries do say Tibet is a part of China. They have no qualms. Dutch government also says
is vocal about it because
vocal.
Okay, it is.
it's a one China policy.
Yeah, one China policy means that.
That's the holy mantra in the Netherlands. One China policy, one China policy, one China policy.
That means Taiwan is a part of China.
Yes.
Tibet is a part of China.
Yes, that's the official Dutch position.
Yeah.
And when we talk about human rights, then it's the EU dialogue. And when it comes to trade, then it's the international trade organizations that are defining the rules. So when it comes to morals, the Netherlands presents itself as a big country, and when it comes to human rights and other issues, then we are a small country. Then we say, well, no, it's not the Netherlands that can make a difference. We have to do it through the EU. And the EU says a one China policy, so the Dutch government says one China policy. The Dutch government does not have the guts to move away from that narrative, unfortunately.
But they can remain quiet on that?
Maybe
you can lobby for that.
They will have to answer Dutch Parliament.
Yeah.
Because Dutch Parliament can stand up and say, can ask questions and can put motions to the table, like we did in, I think it was 2004. We tabled a motion, I myself did that with the late Mr. Hans van Balen, related to the Dutch position on arms trade and the arms embargo, because at the time there was an international discussion to lift the arms embargo. And we kept it in place. But that was only because parliamentarians had the guts to speak up, and the Dutch position was, we're not going to address the issue unless other European member states support this position. So the Dutch have never been very courageous when it comes to the China policy in the EU debate. We always wait for other bigger countries to take a position, and then we follow. The Dutch are not, unfortunately, not as courageous as we like to see ourselves.
But the Dutch support dialogue with the Dalai Lama, representative of the Dalai Lama, to resolve the issue.
It is part of the debate, but only part of the debate. The Dutch are not in a leading position in the EU when it comes to the Dalai Lama, unfortunately.
Would you like to respond?
Yes, I think that the energy on this whole debate of Tibet comes from other countries at the moment. Czech Republic, Lithuania, it's more in the former Soviet sort of influence areas, And we organized this visit of the parliamentarians exactly to bring this energy also to Middle and Northern Europe. And we will have to see. I don't want to speculate. The next presidency is for the EU is Sweden. And we will see if the visit will have some effect. In the Czech Parliament, we were able to have our Tibetan flag, even in the upper chamber. And as you see, it was on a completely different level than it would be here or elsewhere, or Germany, let's say. And we have to recognize that the situation in Europe are very, very diverse. But I think we need to prepare this. We need to make some good moves. We have to inform the public. We have to ask the parliamentarians, and then when we ask the government, then the government may sort of reconsider their position. So I think just rush into the in a sort of a quick confrontation with the government is not, maybe at this point not advisable, but it has to build up. It has to be built up.
Okay, thank you. So personally, I'm again a Tibetan activist on a grassroots level, meaning on a very local level, and often on a grassroots level of Tibetan activism and Tibetan political campaigning, we often collaborate with other movements, such as the Uyghur movement, the Hong Kongers, and on a grassroots level, we're quite interconnected, we're a tight community. And I wonder, to what extent do you plan on collaborating with other movements? Or even to what extent do you believe intersectionality can be beneficial for our movement, or maybe even constrain our movement?
Yes, definitely. It's, for example, on 10th of December, we are having this demonstration, this rally, this protest action on the Dam. There is a letter that we have sort of drafted. It's on the website of the Tibet Subgroup Group Netherlands. We asked our members to sign this letter. We have asked also the Uyghur community. In fact, the Uyghur community came to us, and also they were the initiant of a letter which addressed this issue. And we are participating in it. We will invite them also to participate. So there is this interact, and I think that's incredibly important. There's nothing that I would sort of can think of that speaks against such cooperation.
If anybody else have any last responses, because then we can end on a positive note of collaborating with other movements.
I think it's important to mention at what time you expect us to be at the Dam Square on the 10th of December.
The Dawla, maybe Dawla is here, one of the organizers.
It's a Saturday.
13th, right?
It's 2 to 6.
2 to 6.
On the 10th?
On
10th of December.
10.
Of December,
At
2
2
to
o'clock.
6. At Dam Square. Everyone be there. Come join.
Good.
Human Rights Day,
Yes, Human Rights
10
Day.
December. Also, the Nobel Peace Prize conferment day to His Holiness, 10 December.
Okay, then I think we can now open the floor to the public. If anybody has any questions, yes, please go.
You addressed the whole issue of kind of changing attitudes about Tibet's independence in the past. I think that's a very hard mountain to climb up because of like you say, many countries just accept that Tibet is part of China. What I is for you to tap into the anti-colonial narrative in the world today. And in particular, I mean,
Yeah, maybe a mic.
all the oh, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Sorry, all the minority areas in China, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, they're not Han majority areas. You can see them also as part of an extended Chinese empire. And there are very powerful arguments to say that Tibet is being very actively colonized now with transfers of population, economic exploitation. Are you taking full advantage of this narrative, and have you thought about that?
Maybe the boarding schools? Could be
Yeah,
a
we've
good
been
starting point?
actually using those language more than before. I wanted to clarify here as well. The exile government's policy is still the middle way approach. So there's no change that we are not saying
Could
we
you
are looking
maybe
for.
elaborate what the middle way approach
Yeah.
means to everybody?
So the middle way approach is really looking at genuine autonomy for Tibet. It's a vision of His Holiness, but it has been endorsed by the Tibetan Parliament unanimously. So unless that changes, we are still going with autonomy. But what we are saying is the fact that Tibet is not a part of China is also important in negotiating with China. Otherwise, China doesn't have, we don't have any leverage to negotiate with China if we say that Tibet is a part of China. Because Tibet is illegally occupied, and that is why we are negotiating. And it will be the Tibetan people who will decide whether we should, we have the right to self-determination, so we will decide whether, after negotiating with China. But till such time as that, we have to say that Tibet is not a part of China. It is an occupied nation. Not that we are saying, I'm not saying as a member of parliament or as a government in exile that we are now changing our stand. That's not happened yet. It will only happen with the change in the policy. Current policy is still the middle way policy, looking for genuine autonomy for Tibet with negotiation, with dialogue with China. But for that dialogue to happen also, we need to make it very clear that Tibet is illegally occupied. So yeah, your question on anti-colonial narratives, we are doing that now. We are saying that Tibet is colonized by China, invaded by China. We've also recently talked about the colonial boarding schools. There is a very nice report on that by one of the groups, Tibet Action Institute, talking about how Tibetan children from the age of 4 to about 18, 16 are being kind of taken away from home, away and bereft of their own language, and being indoctrinated, not just away from their language and being taught Chinese, but also being indoctrinated into Chinese ideology, to have so-called Chinese patriotism, all that is happening. And that is really another form of cultural genocide.
Okay, we have another question over there. Yes?
Thank you. I'm Peter Lok from Texel. What I do remember from the past is that it was a kind of strategy of the Dalai Lama to leave the discussion about being independent from China or not, just to lower the threshold for the dialogue with China. Do I remember that wrong? And what is the reason to change that attitude?
Can you please repeat? Sorry. Couldn't get it properly.
What I remember, the strategy of the Dalai Lama was to leave the discussion of being the independent Tibet or dependent Tibet. That was not an issue any longer. Just to lower the threshold to keep on in the dialogue with China. And I think now the new policy is changed. Tibet wants to be independent again. And what is the reason for the change?
I think you've got it a little bit wrong, I would say.
Okay.
Because in our dialogue with China, we have very clearly given them a whole memorandum of genuine autonomy, where we have said that we are looking for genuine autonomy. Just like Wangbola mentioned, we also have Strasbourg proposal where we have said that we want to be self-governed democratic entity within China under autonomy. So all the 3 traditional provinces of Tibet will be self-governed in a democratic entity. You know, we want to, except for foreign affairs and security, everything will be within the self-governed by the Tibetans. All decisions regarding economy, development, trade, education, culture, everything will be done by the Tibetans. So that was there in the discussion. Not that we left everything for the dialogue and China can decide whether they give us autonomy or that is not true. What has changed now is the increasing realization that unless we emphasize that Tibet is an occupied nation, there is no kind of leverage for us to discuss anything with China. Because unless we emphasize to China that historically Tibet was never a part of China, Tibet is an illegally occupied nation, why would China come to the table? They would say that, oh, you are a part of us, so we don't have any will or nor do, it's our domestic affair, internal affair, so nobody should even talk about dialogue with Tibetan representatives. So this is a strategy that we are using. It's actually the truth, that we didn't really pronounce it, but we always knew it, that Tibet was never a part of China, but we are willing to accept a dialogue where we are negotiating, you know, genuine autonomy for Tibet.
Yes.
Change in I think we have actually really understood what our narrative should be. It's a Tibetan narrative.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. I think, yes?
Thank you so much, Kunso, and thank you to all the panelists. I actually have a few comments and a question. The comments are that, of course, I agree with everything that's been said on, you know, the position of the Dutch government. Yet, there have been some small successes, and I think we shouldn't forget those.
Yeah.
We even, I would say, have to remind our own government of their own position that they took, because on the issue of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the Dutch government actually on the 11th of November 2019, in an official letter to Parliament, as a position of the government, has stated that it is up to His Holiness and the Tibetan people to decide on the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. Now, many members of Parliament and also the current government, our ministers, have forgotten that this letter was written. So I think it's up to us to go back to the government and say, hey, this is your formal position. You took it on the 11th of November 2019 and assume that it hasn't changed and build on it and remind them again and again. Now, in our government, there's also a special representative for religious, the freedom of religion and belief. He is another entry point if you don't always want to take the human rights entry point. This is another way to engage the government at the ambassador level, so much higher level than the policy officers, which is important. And the human rights ambassador has always been on our side for many, many years, and the current one also still is. But she's stuck with a dialogue that is at the moment not happening with China. Now, the second thing is the language issue is extremely important, Yunela, as you mentioned, because not only does the Dutch government speak about minorities, they speak about the Tibetans as a religious minority, so not even an ethnic minority. And I think this whole distinction between people, minority, religious minority, this is extremely important to clarify and try to nudge the government into using that term. And one thing that may help there is that the only resolution ever adopted by the UN, while China was a member of the UN in the United Nations Subcommission, 1991, on Tibet, uses the word people. And it was used exactly with this idea in mind. As long as you describe the Tibetans as a people, they have the right to, you at least safeguard their right to self-determination. So what I'm basically saying is there are these things in history that have a tendency to kind of disappear unless they are, you know, remembered and used in our advocacy. Now, my question is, sorry to be so long, but I thought, you know, it's useful because it's good to be critical, but also good to remember the successes sometimes. My question is, when you talk about democracy and wanting to be an example, I think it's amazing that His Holiness, like one of the first things he did when he came into exile, actually, I think two things. He took the children from the road where they were in very dangerous conditions, where their parents were working on the roads high up in the Himalayan, the Tibetan refugee parents, and built schools for them. But the second thing he did is to set up parliament in exile. It was done, I think, Yunala, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think even in 1960 or so, that the first Tibetan parliament, that time not elected, but was appointed. Very important. It shows His Holiness' dedication to democracy. But you, as a parliament member, if you want to be an example to the world, how democratic do you think the Tibetan parliament really is at the moment? Because it's a young parliament. Can you say something about that?
Thank you, Krista. I also wanted to ask you, the 11th November 2019 formal position, is that a resolution in the parliament or what was it?
It's a letter. It's a letter from the minister.
Letter.
A letter from the minister to parliament. Actually,
Okay,
the
letter.
context was we had in 2019 a China note, not a strategy. There was a demand from parliament for a China strategy.
Yes.
The government drafted a note, and then a lot of political parties, right and left and center, were very unhappy because on the issue of human rights there was almost nothing, and there was no position on Xinjiang and Tibet. Those were the main points of criticism. So basically the minister was sent back to the drawing table, and in order to avoid him having to rewrite the China note, he decided to send a letter. And in the letter to Parliament, just before a debate with him on the issue, he explicitly narrated for the first time in Dutch political history a position on Tibet, a position on Xinjiang, and a number of other very important, more general points pertaining to China.
Thank you. So your question on how democratic our exile Tibetan parliament is, we are, like you said, the exile parliament, it's actually the vision of His Holiness. Everybody gets very surprised because many countries really strive for democracy. There are bloodsheds for democracy. There's revolution for democracy. We smoothly transitioned, under the vision of His Holiness. In fact, I think our people were not really, at that time, in 1960, they were really lost in their own kind of livelihood and survival issues and not really thinking about that there's a government and the government will take care, But His Holiness was very adamant that we must have democratic system. So in 1960, 2nd September, the first Tibetan democracy, parliamentarian members were sworn in. And that day is, in fact, celebrated among us as Tibetan Democracy Day, 2nd September. So, from there, we have, I think, traveled quite far, I feel. There are also still room for improvement. But I think we are democratic. How vibrant we are, I think it's individual questions, right? I can have my own view, somebody else might have their own view. But we have freedom of expression, we have elections, and there are, you have about 10 women in the parliament out of 45. I don't know whether that's proper representation or not. But I think... Maybe not. I feel not. And, I think democracy is also not perfect anywhere in the world, right? And we are really young, and I feel that there are lots and lots of room for improvement. There is, like how in democracy sometimes there is minorities who create problem. When I'm saying minority, I don't mean the Chinese minority, or there are majorities who are creating problem, majoritarian tyranny or minority, I don't know. So there are all those issues that happen, and but we still have, I think, voice. We are able to express, and sometimes people do self-censoring also, like in democracy. So democracy is also not perfect, and but I think I still feel that it's the best system, and democracy can flourish only when people have a sense of respect and, for diversity, for diverse opinion. And there's also a lot of awareness and education, So all that, I think we are doing quite well compared to where we were before, but there's still a lot of scope for improvement, yeah.
I think that on that note, we will end this panel discussion. I think it was a very fruitful round-the-table talk that we had. I think a lot of thoughts were shared. I hope you gained a lot of new knowledge or have some food for thought. I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank our public. I I would like to thank Pakhuis to Zwijger and just everyone and everything that made this into reality. I think we'll go for drinks now.
Thank you. You were awesome. Thank you.
Very good.